Okay, welcome, Philosophy of Biology class. Today I'm just going to sort of very quickly remind you of the papers that we read in the section on evolution and ethics, kind of place them all together in one context, and maybe think about how they relate to each other. So remember, we started this section by asking, what does evolution, or maybe biology more generally, really have to do with ethics? On the face of it, there's kind of three obvious types of positions. After all, either evolution is related to ethics or it's not. Now, if it's related, it might be sort of positively related. That is, by thinking about evolution, we could somehow learn about ethics. It could support ethical truths, or maybe somehow just give us ethics. But it might be related in the sense that it actually undermines ethics. Maybe it debunks ethics. So maybe learning about the fact that our brain is the product of natural selection might actually show us that there are no ethical truths, or maybe just that we don't know what they are and our beliefs are unjustified. A third option is, of course, that evolution is just irrelevant. It's like learning facts about chemistry or physics. They're true facts about the world, but they don't actually answer any questions that we might have about ethics. So which one of these views is right? And of course, each of these is really kind of a type of view. There's a lot more nuance going on that you would have to figure out. Now, the papers that we read for this section, we sort of read them in the order that they were published. Maybe it's not the best conceptual order. I'll talk about that in a moment. Michael Ruse and E.O. Wilson in 1986 in the journal Philosophy published a paper called Moral Philosophy as Applied Science. Then we read Elliot Sober's Prospects for an Evolutionary Ethics. That was written for part of an intro anthology textbook, Introduction to Philosophy, and then later it was just published in part of a collection of his essays called From a Biological Point of View. That collection of essays is in Blackboard if you want to look at other essays there. Also in that collection, and in fact written directly for that collection, not published elsewhere, is a paper that he wrote called Did Evolution Make Us Psychological Egoists? Now that became a much larger project, and he ended up writing a book with David Sloan Wilson called Unto Others, The Evolutionary Origins of Unselfish Behavior. That is also in Blackboard if you want to take a look at that. In 2017, a volume, a Cambridge Handbook of Evolutionary Ethics, came out. I think it was the result of a conference held at Florida State, perhaps. That book is also available on Blackboard. One paper in that book, based on a presentation, was Justin Horn, Evolution and the Epistemological Challenge to Moral Realism. And then finally, we read Kim Sterelny and Ben Fraser. This is just a paper written in a journal article, Evolution and Moral Realism, in 2017. Okay, so I'm going to kind of just go through those papers. And actually, I want to talk about Sober on altruism first, because in a sense, it sort of directly follows up from Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. So first of all, it's really important to distinguish two kinds of altruism. We talked about this on the very first day of class. One kind of altruism is just enhancing the welfare of another at a cost to self. You might think of this as economic altruism. If I have money and I give it to you to help you, that's altruistic. Done. But that doesn't involve motives at all. If you, for example, find out that the reason I did that was that I wanted to become known as a philanthropist, then you might think it's selfish. And that is a sense of psychological altruism or psychological selfishness. If the behavior that's ultimately motivated by a desire to enhance the welfare of another, that's altruistic. To be selfish is to say ultimately it's a selfish desire. And that's in terms of motivation. So for example, Dawkins might be talking about plants that can be altruistic. Of course, he's talking about economic altruist. He's just talking about the effects of the behavior, not about the motivations at all. Now, if you think of welfare in the economic sense as fitness, as biological fitness, that is enhancing the fitness of another, that's the standard definition of biological altruism. It's very close to what Dawkins is talking about, although he never really talked about fitness. And that led to a little discussion that I had with Elliot Sober in that interview of his which is available on YouTube, the interview that I did of him. Okay, so there's two different senses of altruism. Now, Dawkins, as I said, he's talking about economic altruism. And if you think about it, it sort of leads to this puzzle. Well, wait a minute. Being economically altruistic is actually bad for you, sort of by definition. So how could natural selection ever lead to those behaviors? Why would any animals behave in a way that was bad for them? But actually, Dawkins says now you might have thought group selection works. Sober would say it does, but the standard view in biology, and certainly Dawkins' view, is that group selection doesn't work, but that there are two things that do. The first is kin selection. Actually, behaviors that are bad for you can be good for your genes. So imagine that a gene causes a particular behavior. That gene will spread as long as it causes more copies of itself to be around. Well, many copies of your genes are in other bodies. And a particularly easy way to help copies of your genes is to help your kin, because they're just much more likely to have copies of your genes. And so kin selection is one way that altruistic behavior can emerge due to natural selection. The second is reciprocal altruism, and these are things that are in the short term genuinely costly. Sometimes in the long term they're costly too. You just make a mistake. But as long as on average they're beneficial, so as long as there's the possibility that they help you in the future, and on average they do, then they can evolve. And so that's, for example, playing tit for tat in a prisoner's dilemma type situation. It is right then, the moment you behave, it would be better to defect. But in the long run, being in a population with a bunch of other individuals, if you're going to play each other multiple times, for example, it can be better for you in the long run to play tit for tat. Not always, but it's possible. Note, by the way, it's very plausible that reciprocal altruism is misnamed. It's not really altruistic. After all, it is in your best interest, just in the long run. But that name has just now been used for 40 years, so it's not going away. So we'll keep using that name. Okay, so Dawkins is talking about economic altruism. Now, Sober asks this question: what about psychological altruism? Maybe natural selection would weed that out. After all, many people seem to have this idea that people are ultimately selfish. And after all, if you only understood biology, or if you understood evolution, you'd see why we're all selfish. Call this view psychological egoism, the view that any desires you have ultimately must come from some selfish desire. So you're never altruistic in the psychological sense. Now, would evolution lead to that? Well, actually, there's no reason whatsoever to think that. At least in the first case, the economic case, there is sort of a puzzle. Why would you behave in a way that harms yourself? But if the question is, why would you ever care about anybody else? Well, that's easy. Caring about other people is a good way to spread your genes. For example, in the obvious case of taking care of your own kids. Now, many animals take care of their kids and don't actually, for example, love them. This is just one possible mechanism, but it's very plausible that you do better. You actually do a better job of spreading your genes if you genuinely care about your kids. Same thing if you're trying to find romantic partners and you actually love them versus think of it as a selfish investment. Well, selfishly speaking, yeah, you can sometimes do things and end up with a romantic partner, and that can work well. But if you genuinely care about them, chances are it's going to go even better. And that will enhance your fitness. Same thing with having friends. And as Sterling and Fraser talked about later on, we'll get to this, reputation matters. If you genuinely care about other people, so like you're fair because you actually care about them, not just to be selfish, that's going to enhance your reputation. That can actually be good for you. Okay, so now that's altruism. What does altruism have to do with ethics? It's actually not that clear if you're trying to be very careful. On the face of it, it should have something to do with ethics. It does seem like selfishness and ethical behavior are sort of come apart. After all, if being selfish, if ethics required being selfish all the time, then we wouldn't really think of it as, they would never conflict. So we know that selfish behavior sometimes conflicts with ethics. So altruism is somehow related to morality, although there's no straightforward requirement to always be altruistic in every case or anything like that. What altruism does, that is caring about other people, does seem to be sort of at the heart of what we think about as moral behavior. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the other papers that we talked about. So the first paper we read was Michael Ruse and E.O. Wilson in 1986, called Moral Philosophy as Applied Science. And actually the title alone kind of gives away what they're trying to do. Now, so Michael Ruse is a philosopher, E.O. Wilson is a biologist. And E.O. Wilson in 1975, in his massive tome, Sociobiology, among other things, suggested that maybe the time has come for ethics to be removed temporarily from the hands of the philosophers and biologicized. This paper is a kind of high-level first pass at, what that would mean, why this is important, why should we do it. They don't really talk about very many cases or what the ethical truths would be. They just sort of give maybe the beginnings of a research program. So here's some quotes, both on 174. First, they say that biology shows that internal moral premises do exist and can be defined more precisely. Now, that's as opposed to these, what they call extrasomatic moral truths outside of ourselves. They think they don't exist. They say that's a fiction, just like the Izod gap is a fiction, they say. Now, what about these moral premises? Well, they're immanent. They arise from the unique programs of the brain that originated during evolution. Morality, human morality, is special to our species. It's different in other animals. If we had evolved differently, it would be different. They're adamant that morality is something that we humans do. We reason morally, and we mean moral for humans. If we reason differently, morality would be different. So, the Star Trek aliens who came, who are very intelligent, they may have a completely different morality. It's not that they're doing it wrong. That would be their morality. Now, a few sentences later, they say the constraints on this, and they're talking about the mental development, are the sources of our strongest feelings of right and wrong. And they're so strong, they're actually powerful enough to serve as a foundation for ethical codes. So true ethics, the real ethical codes, kind of flow out of our deep-seated moral feelings and moral emotions. It's maybe you might think of it as kind of organizing and cleaning up our emotional responses. So they give these examples of what they call these epigenetic rules that arise in development. For example, how color vision works. So across cultures, even when they use different words for different cultures, different words for different colors in different cultures, there are some commonalities that all kind of normal humans have. And that's because of the way our brain is structured, because of the way we evolve, right? And they talk about how various phobias work. We're afraid of snakes and heights. We're not afraid of electrical outlets. We haven't evolved that kind of fear yet. They give a bunch of other examples of how evolution has shaped our brain and our reasoning. They talk about mathematical reasoning and other kinds of reasoning. Now, the suggestion is that moral rules are just like this. So the behaviors are not fixed. We're just sort of naturally more likely to feel to feel guilt at a certain kind of behavior than others. Now, we can learn our way out of that. We can be socialized differently. Different people have different moral behaviors after all. But moral reasoning is molded and constrained by epigenetic rules, they say. That's why moral codes across the globe, even though they differ in many ways, they're kind of at the core, fundamentally the same. All moral codes have something like the golden rule based at the heart of them. And it's about thinking about others as equals. It's about in-group, out-group differentiation. These are kind of, not harming, protecting your kin. These are kind of fundamental moral rules that all moral systems are kind of based on them. So as an example, consider moral norms against incest. The norms are tied up with these deep emotional feelings that we have when we think about incest. And there are evolutionary reasons that we feel the way we do. And these feelings are strong enough, Ruse and Wilson would suggest, to actually determine what the moral codes are. Now, Elliot Sober's paper is written partially in a response to this, but also just many other people have tried various kinds of, shouldn't biology be relevant for ethics? And so just as a very beginning, he just wants to start the paper by saying, well, now, wait a minute. We need to distinguish two kinds of claims. First, there's descriptive claims about why we believe what we do. So, for example, the vast majority of Americans alive now believe that killing animals for food is morally permissible. On the other hand, they believe that incest is morally wrong. They believe that causing gratuitous pain to animals for no reason is wrong. It's just a descriptive fact about what we believe. But there's a different kind of claim. The claim that killing animals for food is actually permissible or actually wrong. Those are normative claims. You ought to behave a certain way, or you may behave a certain way. You ought not to behave a certain way. Those are normative claims. Now, evolution, and really science more generally, Sober says, is kind of obviously relevant for one. Yes, evolution is very much related to why we have the view that we do about incest. But it just doesn't actually tell us that incest is wrong. That's a totally different question. We need to think about the moral facts. Now, part of why Sober thinks this is kind of so obvious that these are different is that he ends up defending a version of Hume's thesis, or what's sometimes called Hume's law, or Hume's dictum. So this is David Hume, a Scottish philosopher. One of his major works, A Treatise of Human Nature, 1739, he suggests that normative claims, like, for example, killing is wrong, can't be deduced from purely descriptive claims. So here are some descriptive claims that could be, for example, studied by science and sociologists and anthropologists, biologists. So killing is against the law. Killing causes pain. Most people believe killing is wrong. Those are just descriptive facts, and I could add a whole bunch more about killing. But can you go from there directly to the conclusion that killing is wrong? Hume says no. You need some other kind of moral premise, like that causing pain is wrong or that breaking the law is wrong. And if you don't have those as premises, you can't get ought in the conclusion. Now, Sober accepts that. And in fact, he even strengthens it. Not only can you not deduce the conclusion logically, but the descriptive claims don't even provide support, not even evidence for the normative claims, at least on their own. They need to be combined with normative claims. Okay. Now, one way that Sober kind of spells this out is by saying, look, just consider some basic metaethics. Okay, so here's two basic metaphysical questions. And this will form a tree, a decision tree of what view you have. First, are moral claims ever true? Now, if the answer is no, then Sober is just going to call that view subjectivist. As he says, there's no facts, only opinions in ethics. Now, for example, in my interview with Justin Horn, he talked about a simple subjectivism that says, if I believe it, then it's true. So that is actually not what Sober is talking about. He's talking about a view where there are no moral facts, not even just, the ones that you think. It's not true for you. It's true for nobody. So that would be a form of nihilism. Or if you think moral claims are beliefs, but none of them are true, that would be error theory. That's the way that Justin Horn defined that. But now let's say you think that there are moral claims can be true or false, and some of them are true. Well, now, why are they true? If they're true, regardless of what people think, that is, they're not made true by people's judgments, they're true for some other reason, that's realism. If they're true because of what people think, it's a kind of conventionalism. So Sober brings up relativism as an example. He describes divine command theory as an example of this too, although that I think would be pretty controversial. But the point is, these are different meta-ethical views about what ethics is. Now, which one does Bruce and Wilson have? Well, he says it's not clear. In some places, they suggest that these deep moral feelings actually help us define moral truth, that incest really is wrong, for example. But other times, so that would be maybe a kind of realism. But other times, they talk as though there are no objective moral truths, that morality is a kind of illusion caused by our genes. When you have Sober's distinction in mind, here's the question. Are they only talking descriptively about our moral reasoning and why we have the views we do? Well, if they are, then it's consistent with any metaethical view. They could then go on to say, and there's no moral facts, or they could go on to say, and there are moral facts and we don't know them, or they could go on to say, and there are moral facts and they come from evolution. It could be any of those three. Now, Sober does sort of leave an opening. He suggests, this is in 1994, before very many authors had really written about this. he kind of gives a hint at the beginning of a debunking argument. Here's a genetic argument that he gives, a very simple form he calls argument G. Genetic for as in the origins. So the genealogy of your beliefs. So premise, we believe the ethical statements we do because of evolution and because of facts about our socialization. Imagine that's true. Here's a bold conclusion. Boom, therefore no ethical statement is true. Now he says, look, you can't deduce that. But actually, maybe there is a plausible argument if you add another premise that actually the processes that determine what moral beliefs we have are entirely independent of what moral statements are true. If you add that to the claim that the source of our beliefs is evolution, well then actually they wouldn't be true, or they're probably untrue. Or maybe a better version is that they're unjustified. Note, that's exactly what the debunkers believe. Soper kind of brings it up as, well, I guess there is this argument that you could have. Maybe it's pretty good. And Justin Horn's like, yeah, that's exactly my argument, and that's why you can't be a moral realist. So let's talk about Horn on evolutionary debunking. He suggests that if moral realism is true, that is, if the truths are somehow independent of us, if we're not making them true, then it's very plausible that we don't know what they are. They wouldn't be justified, because roughly we'd have these beliefs whether or not they were true. We're not tracking the truth. In cases of kind of object perception, right? If there's an elephant there, you see the elephant. If there's no elephant there, you don't see the elephant. It's not perfect, but our perceptual beliefs are justified. If I look around the room, I don't see an elephant right now, so there's not one. I could be wrong. There could be some sort of weird illusion going on. But the idea is that my eyes track the truth. They're tied to what is actually out there. Your perceptions generally are. But what about your moral perceptions? Well, if we're not tracking the truth, if instead we're tracking, what's adaptive to believe, that's a worry. That's the basic debunking argument. So Horn talks about two different kinds of tracking. First, you could imagine this kind of direct tracking. Why do you believe that killing is wrong? Because it's wrong. We're somehow picking up on the truth of it. And he says, but as long as you buy this kind of plausible premise that natural selection is kind of deeply related to why we have the views we do, the problem is we would make those judgments anyway because they're adaptive, even if the moral judgments were false. Kind of imagine moral reality being otherwise, we would still believe exactly what we did. So we're not actually tracking the truth, we're actually tracking what's adaptive. Now, you could imagine a kind of indirect tracking view, which says, it's true we believe them because we're adaptive. But luckily, being moral is adaptive. So we are capturing the moral truth. This is in fact what Strelny and Fraser, I think, would suggest, although they probably think of it as direct tracking. I'm not sure. But here's the suggestion. We're tracking something which is actually correlated with moral truth. It just so happens being moral is in fact good for us. Now, Horn suggests here that the problem is there's no way we can be sure what is actually correlated with what we're tracking. Maybe we're close, maybe we're distorted, maybe we're off in one direction. He says we'd have no way of knowing whether we're distorted or not, and if we are distorted, in which direction. What if morality was just very different? We wouldn't know. And since we can't know if it was different, then we can't trust our judgments right now. So this leads us directly to Strelny and Fraser's paper. They're very worried about evolutionary debunking arguments. They want to be moral realists. They want to talk about the evolution of morality, of moral cognition, of why we make the judgments we do. They think it's heavily tied to biology, but they still want to think that there are moral claims that are true. So they're worried about debunking. So what do they say? Well, first of all, you have to understand what they think moral truths actually are. They think that the moral truths are those that support cooperation and enhance social cohesion. That's actually what makes something morally good. So when we have these difficult trade-offs, for example, we're worried about saving lives, but maybe by, say, social distancing and quarantining, but actually, let's say it makes people unhappy and maybe harms our economy, and maybe it's in the long run problematic for various reasons. These are tough moral trade-offs. What's the actual moral truth here? What's actually the best thing to do? What should we do? Well, they sort of suggest, they don't define it. This isn't a careful definition, but in general, they want the moral thing to do, the thing that's actually good for us, that actually supports social cooperation, enhances cohesion, it's good for us in the long run. And it turns out that human societies, because of the way we're structured, because we're such social creatures, because of the way we've evolved, this is not true for fish, for example, that being moral, that is doing the things which support cooperation, can actually be good for you. Actually, we can learn about moral reality by seeing what works. We can see how other people behave. We can see if they're selfish or if they're altruistic or if they have friends or if they take care of their kids. We can see which cultures collectively do things. We can see which social groups have various norms, and we can see what works. So we can learn. And they argue actually that moral knowledge, understanding the moral truth, being right, is a fuel for success. So through various moral emotions, through cultural group selection, through just looking around in heterogeneous environments and seeing what works, we can learn about morality. We're getting better at it. Moral progress. So we're making moral progress. And we're kind of, it's only a partial vindication. Morality, they say, has historically been tied up with a lot of untrue things, maybe some bizarre religious claim we think is the foundation. Well, ancient astronomers had bizarre claims about why the sun moved around the earth. Well, it turns out it doesn't even move around the earth. I mean, they were way wrong, but they were still tracking a lot of really important things about the way the solar system worked. Similarly, Storelli and Fraser are going to say, we can trust our moral judgments. We're pretty good at tracking because it is actually adaptive for us to be moral. And so we're learning what works. So how should we think about all these papers together? Well, that's a tough question. It's not clear. I think in philosophy, the hard questions are precisely those that aren't clear. If it's clear, then you bring it up, and there are a lot of things that are clear. But you bring it up, you dismiss it, and you move on. Now we're stuck with the hard question. Okay, so are there moral truths? Can we be justified in knowing them? How are they related to evolution? This is tough stuff. So I'm going to leave it there. Just as a reminder, I'll be on Zoom on Tuesday, Thursday during our regular class time, and you have a paper to write about this. So our next section will be about biology and race, and I'll see you then.